So, oops, huge problem this morning with the PowerPoint slide files. And that's okay, because I had a backup, and there wasn't that much of the lecture left, and we can just record it here from my office, which is kind of messy, but still works. Okay, so we had left off about to move into prejudice and discrimination. And this is a set of concepts that tends to trip students up because they smush them together into one idea and don't separate them out and notice that there's two things going on. First, prejudice. And the important thing to remember about prejudice is that it's in people's heads. It's ideas, it's feelings, it's prejudging, it's concepts. A really good example for prejudice is my grandmother, who's been dead 20 years. And she lived in New Jersey, which is a very, very diverse part of the country. So you were surrounded by people from all over the world. But at some point, she decided that she was extraordinarily upset that some Italians had moved in next to her. I cannot repeat in this lecture the things my grandmother said about those Italian neighbors. But she loathed them. And she loathed their Italianness of them, and she told us so frequently. Now the thing is, that was prejudice, not discrimination. She did not treat them any differently than any of the other neighbors of the many other ethnicities that were on her block. And after about 10 years, they had a garden, they brought her vegetables, they were always polite. Eventually she changed gears and was telling us about her lovely Italian neighbors. So good news, prejudice can change. But it's not about what you do. A person can be extraordinarily prejudiced and not do anything discriminating. Likewise, a person can discriminate without prejudicial feelings. Because the next term, right, discrimination, behaviors, things people or organizations do that limit the rights, freedoms, opportunities, or access to rewards for people based on group membership. Discrimination can be personal in that a waiter refuses to serve someone of a minority group at a restaurant, or a banker decides not to give someone of a minority a home loan, or a hiring officer says, I'm not going to hire any of those people. Or it can be completely impersonal. For example, a lot of private colleges, and even a few public colleges, have something called legacy admissions, which is where if you had a parent or grandparent or some other relative go to the college before, your application gets a couple of extra points. Now, applications having points doesn't make sense when we talk about college, because here at OSU OKC, we take everybody who applies. And if you're not ready for college, we have classes that will get you ready for college. But there are colleges out there that only take a certain number of students, and when they've got those students, that's all they take. And so applications become quite competitive. And it turns out that when you look at the impact of legacy admissions on college entry, you know, people say that there is a problem with affirmative action because it puts unqualified minorities in classrooms with classwork they're not ready to do and takes a seat away from someone more qualified. But more people who are unqualified make it into college under legacy admissions, which mainly still favor white people, than make it in under any sort of affirmative action program. So yeah, our colleges are full of people who are totally not prepared to be there. And I say that as a person whose first college roommate was a legacy admission who was totally not prepared to be there and failed out the first term badly. But nobody pays attention to legacy admissions. Nobody complains about legacy admissions, but that's a form of institutional discrimination. All right. And we need to talk briefly about racism, because some people talk about reverse racism. Now, it is true. Members of minorities can be prejudiced, and members of minorities can discriminate. But members of minorities, people who are not the dominant group, can't be racist, because racism is an overriding system of a social organization that systematically puts barriers in front of some people and systematically puts shortcuts in front of others. And an example of those barriers and shortcuts would be legacy admissions, right? Some people get to go straight to the top of the class, even if they don't have the test scores, even if they don't have the grades, just because they happen to be in the right group. All right, good? Okay. Now, we need to talk in a little bit more detail about prejudice, because it's important to keep in mind that prejudice is learned. Prejudice is part of culture. We acquire prejudices through socialization. when we're born into a group or join a group that has a prejudice going on. The pictures for the example there are about a psychologist who actually went out and created intergroup prejudice. It was the 1950s. He was doing his experiment on 9 and 10-year-old boys, and what he did was recruit a whole bunch of boys who were similar in social class, neighborhood, region, and all the ways they could measure them. They were the same group of boys. Randomly divided them into 2 groups and sent them off for summer camp for 3 weeks. The summer camp was here in Oklahoma, which is really cool, and I've been there. It's wonderful. All right, so the first week, the boys were separated. They were never allowed to come in contact with each other. They went camping, they went fishing, they went boating, they played baseball, they swum. They built their own in-group rituals, right? Each group made its own flag. One group swam totally naked. That's just the thing they did. Another group had certain cheers they did before they did activities. They built these group identities. And after those identities were solid, the psychologist and his psychological camp staff brought the 2 groups together and had them start competing with each other. And they competed for small prizes that were cool for boys back in the day, pocket knives, stuff like that. And there were winners and losers. There was no compromise. There was no joint winning. It was either or. And the competition became very fierce. There was a lot of name calling. The big baseball tournament had a definite winner and a definite loser. The losers got mad and broke into the winner's cabin and stole their underwear. So the winners stole the loser's flag and ripped it in half. I mean, there were a food fight in the cafeteria. There was really, really nasty name calling. And I should point out that back in the 50s, these were all considered normal, healthy behaviors for middle school boys. So the psychologists weren't doing anything horrible to them by the standards of the day. So after a good week of letting them hate each other, the third phase of the plan was to see if they could make them not hate each other. So the camp staff, the psychologist and his crew, damaged the water supply and said to the boys, we've got this problem. The water has stopped. If we can't fix the water, everybody's going to have to go home. So all the boys went, oh, no, can't have that, cooperated to try to find the problem and fix the problem. And they made the problem involve something complicated and heavy. I still don't understand what they did, but it took all of the boys to fix it. And so for the next week, little problems would come up that they would have to fix together. 2 groups were on their way to a picnic, but the truck with the food broke down and they had to get out and change the tire. Cooperate. The camp staff said, we've rented a movie, but we don't have enough money to pay for it. Now, remember, in the 50s, renting a movie was those big reel-to-reel films, and it was pretty expensive. I mean, $20. But they said, we don't have all of it, and the boys, each team decided they would pay for half of what was left so they could all watch a movie together. And things began to get better. The boys still could not eat together in the dining room, but they could work out a system where one group would eat first lunch and dinner one day and the next group would eat first lunch and dinner the next day, so that everybody would have a chance to go first. The last day of camp, they were supposed to go see the state line for Arkansas, which apparently was a really height of cool for middle school boys in the 1950s, but it was. And they all wanted to go really badly, but the camp only had 1 bus, which meant the boys would either somebody would have to go first, and the other group would have to wait for hours and hours, or both groups could go together. And the boys decided that they could put up with each other well enough to go together. So they get on the bus, and they're on their way to the state line, but they can't sing, because there are Rattler songs and Eagle songs, and you can't be singing the other guy's songs. On the way back from the Arkansas state line, which by all accounts was a satisfying and uplifting experience, one of the boys said, let's sing the Star-Spangled Banner, because the Star-Spangled Banner was not a Rattler song or an Eagle song. And after they sang the Star-Spangled Banner, they agreed that they could take turns singing a Rattler song and an Eagle song. Now, these guys were never buddies, but they did stop actively sabotaging and trying to hurt each other, and all of this, each phase of these things, only took a week. All right. This Robbers Cave experiment back in the 1950s was one of the first really big explorations of contact theory. The idea that prejudice can be unlearned. And contact theory says that if you have members of groups that are in conflict with each other, cooperate. Now, you can't have them encounter each other competing. Competing will make it worse. And when they're cooperating under relative equality, that is, you can't have a member of one group supervising a member of another group because, you know, the people you're supervising always seem like they're not working as hard as they could, and they've not got the attitude they should, and the people who are supervising you always seem like they're always on your back. So there's no way to make that relationship a way to improve in-group, out-group conflict. But if you've got 2 people, 5 people, 10 people who are relatively equal and cooperating to solve problems, eventually contact theory says they're going to stop seeing each other as out-group members. They're going to stop seeing just the stereotype, and they'll start to understand each other as complete and real human beings. And that this is really important. The textbook and the picture on the slide has getting kids together, roommates, in college, trying to get people from different groups to know each other. Now, it's true, 2 people from very different groups, the roommate relationship is less likely than usual to, you know, end happily. But when you do that, you do decrease a lot of the in-group, out-group conflict on your campuses, and students actually show much better attitudes toward people in groups that they are not in. Okay. We need to talk briefly about the impact in general of social inequality by race and ethnicity, right? Because this has real impacts on life chances, on the odds of goods and bad things happening to people. There are real barriers to full participation in American economy and culture and politics that some people face because of group membership and others don't. The first item on the list is mortgages. And it turns out, of course it's illegal to take race into account when you give someone a mortgage. It's been illegal for 50 years. But there are ways around that. You know what neighborhood people come from. The address they're trying to buy a house in. There are certain other tells that are leaking in the demographics that if a computer program is setting up likelihood of getting a loan and also interest rates you're going to pay, race still has an impact even if the people applying for the loan are married, have been married for the exact same amount of time, make the exact same amount of money, and have the same employment history. The graph shows applicants whose income was below the median getting and denied a mortgage, applicants whose income was above the median getting or refusing a mortgage, and those at the median getting and refusing a mortgage. And whites have a much easier time getting a mortgage. In addition, on average, when you control for marital status and employment history and income, minority mortgage applicants pay a higher interest rate than white mortgage applicants, and this money being sucked away down the mortgage hole adds up over time. All right. The next thing I want to talk about concretely is crime, and there are a couple of really important examples here. This first one isn't in the book because the study just came out 2 weeks ago. It turns out if you are black, you are much more likely to be wrongfully convicted than if you are white. Now, they studied this by looking at wrongful convictions that later got overturned. New evidence, witness saying, no, that's not the way it happens, or DNA evidence or something like that going on to say, yeah, we got the wrong person. And it turns out, first, if you are black, you are much more likely to be wrongly convicted than if you are white. And if you are wrongly convicted in black, it will take much longer for that to be resolved and you to be released than if you are wrongly convicted in white. All right. When I asked this next one in class, a couple of students who were in class got it. What is the best predictor of who gets the death penalty? Now, I want to say, although whites make up more than 60% of the population, they are less than 30% of people on death row. But it's not race that's the best predictor, race of offender that's the best predictor of who gets the death penalty. It's race of victim. If you kill a white person, you are much more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a black person. And this is a statistical reality that has shown up consistently for years. When people are standing on street corners holding signs that say Black Lives Matter, they don't just mean encounters with police, although I'll get to that next. They also mean when it comes time to prosecute people for crimes committed against black people are just not considered as horrible, as in need of punishment as crimes against members of the dominant group. The next thing I want to point out is that although black people and white people commit the same amount of crime and do the same amount of drugs, and yet we can find that out, people will confess to all sorts of criminal behaviors if you assure them of anonymity. And there have been studies that have followed people, through time. And every way we look at it, white people and black people are committing almost identical amounts of crime, but black people are much more likely to be caught and sent to prison. And part of what's going on is it's a race thing. Black neighborhoods get a whole lot more police attention. And when people get profiled and stopped and frisked for walking down the street, it's not the white people they're stopping and frisking while walking down the street. And even though these stop and frisk policies don't result in lower crime rates or more substantial arrests, what they do result in is lots and lots of young men coming to the attention of the criminal justice system and getting involved with, the criminal justice system for really minor infractions. Now, on top of that, black people and white people do the same amount of drugs, and poor people and rich people do the same amount of drugs. But what neighborhoods are people doing drugs behind closed doors because they got them through prescription creativity? And in what neighborhoods are people doing drugs they're buying out in the street? The drug problem is the same for those different groups, but only some people are likely to be caught and punished for it. And the problem is, doing drugs is bad. Okay, that is so. But if on top of doing drugs, you've also got your employment interrupted because you had to serve a prison term, and you've also got a prison record as an ex-con, so it makes it that much harder to get a job. And, being in prison messes you up. Whatever puts you in there, prison 2 times out of 3 makes it worse. And prison sentences, the stigma, the legal notation of being a felon means you lose your right to vote. In some states, it's almost impossible to get your right to vote back. In Oklahoma, it is possible to get your right to vote back, but a lot of former felons in Oklahoma don't know how to do that, so they might as well not be able to get their right to vote back. And when you have over-policed part of the population so that those people who are committing crimes go to prison and get the record or are taken out of the voting pool, that really, that's systematic disfranchisement. And on top of all of that, of course, if you've got a community where an excessive number of people have been arrested and put in jail, who's raising their kids? Who's supporting those families? Who's holding those communities together? And so it becomes a burden not just on the individual who has got the prison record now, it's a burden widespread on the whole community. All right. I will save the longer version of that for social problems if you care to take that with me. I do want to talk also about employment and racial inequality. There are studies that are done. When you've got a bunch of graduate students and not a lot of money and you want to do some research, you make up a bunch of fake resumes and you give them all equivalent education and equivalent work experience. And you put male names on some and female names on others, and you put black names on some and white names on some and Hispanic names on some, and you send them all out, and you see who gets a callback. And it turns out you are much more likely to get a callback if you have a white-sounding name than if you have a black or Hispanic-sounding name. And this is possibly not even conscious racism, but it does have a huge impact on who's getting what jobs. Okay. The last thing here is health, right? And the impact on health of race and ethnicity. What the graph is showing you is infant mortality rates. Now, before we go further, I want to explain infant mortality. Infant mortality measures for every 1,000 babies born, how many of them are going to die in the first year. When I started taking sociology in the 80s, there were countries where 200 out of every 1,000 babies born died in the first year. That's 1/5. Right now, there is hardly anybody in the world with an infant mortality rate higher than 110. In the United States, infant mortality rates run about a little more than 6 out of 1,000, which sounds pretty good until you notice that there are more than 30 countries with lower infant mortality rates than us. Japan's is about 3 in 1,000. There's a country that's 2.5 in 1,000. I forget the name of it. It's a really small country. Here in the United States, the infant mortality rate for whites is 5.2 out of every 1,000. The infant mortality for black babies is 11.6 per 1,000. That's more than double. Maternal death rates are counted out of the 100,000 because women are much more likely to survive childbirth than the babies. And for that also, the black mortality rate is more than twice the white mortality rate. We also are looking at life expectancy, and race has a substantial impact on life expectancy. In general, for American white people, life expectancy is about 79. For American Asian people, it's about 83. For American black people, it is about 76. Hispanic people I don't have numbers for, and it's not because I haven't looked, it's because a big chunk of the people keeping statistics on this keep it by race. And remember, Hispanic is an ethnicity, so they keep, they divide that Hispanic into the black, the white, the native, the Asian, and so that gets all spread out. It's also partly because the Hispanic population in the United States sometimes skews kind of young, because some people come to work for several years and save up their money and then return home and open the ice cream shop or the hairstylist or whatever small business. So it's not a whole life thing, and we're not getting people to the end of their lives, so it's really hard to measure. Of course, worst of the lot at slightly over 60 is Native Americans. Now, Native American life expectancy, like everything else Native American, varies a whole lot. There are Native Americans right now living on reservations that are still more or less prisoner of war camps. The water may not be safe or available or have to be carried. The heat may not be reliable. The houses may be fallen down shacks. The unemployment rate may be over 34%. And then there are Native Americans in the United States, in places like Oklahoma, where there are a lot of tribes and a lot of big highways and congenial laws and huge amounts of money coming in from Indian gambling and some amount of money coming in still from oil. But even in Oklahoma, there are Indian tribes where people are ridiculously poor and there are no economic bright spots at all. I'm thinking up in the northeast corner of the state by Miami. So life expectancy. The book talks about they followed 40,000 patients, and it turned over a long period, and it turns out that black and white doctors both tended to give more tests and preventive care to white patients than black patients. So this is a huge problem. When black and white patients show up at the emergency room complaining of similar symptoms, white patients are, when they complain of pain, white patients are more likely to get pain medication. And so this is probably not conscious, but the fact that we don't notice it doesn't stop it from happening, having a real impact on people's lives. Good so far? All right, let us move onward and talk just a little bit about theory. We are going to have to stray into psychology a little bit because psychologists spend an awful lot of time studying racism and ethnocentrism in the 1950s. Now remember, in the 1940s, an awful lot of young men had gone off to war in Europe, and they saw a bunch of horrible things, and people doing, really horrible things to each other. And when they got back, they had the GI Bill, so they went to college. And quite a few of them went into psychology trying to answer the questions, trying to look for explanations of the sorts of things they saw in Europe while they were there. So there was quite a lot of research on in-group, out-group hate, and group conflict, and what is going on that makes this happen. Okay, so one of the first things identified was the idea of frustration and scapegoats, right? Everybody is frustrated. Everybody's got bosses that aren't patient or have unreasonable deadlines. Everybody's got clients who are not polite. Everybody's got kids who are not grateful. Everybody's got health problems and doctors who don't answer questions. Everybody's got a commute and a wreck on the highway, and there's so many things to be angry at, and we can't take it out on the people who are responsible, right? When you try to take out your anger at your commute, it's called road rage, and at least, arrest you for that. You try to take out your anger on your boss, and you wind up fired. You can't take your anger out on your customers. I'm sorry, but look, the reason it won't work is not because it's a bad product, it's because you're stupid. It's just not going to get you very far. So people wind up venting their frustration, their anger, on people who can't fight back, on groups of people who are excluded or ignored or don't matter. And okay, yeah, sometimes this is you come home and you beat your wife, or you come home and you hit your kids, or you come home and you kick your dog, or maybe you're walking down the street and you beat up the member of whatever ethnic group you're sure has stolen your job. And that's not wrong, because people do have frustration, and people do take frustration out on people who can't defend themselves. But that doesn't answer the question, why does your society have a group of people who can't defend themselves, right? Why is it okay to blame illegal immigrants or Asians or black people or whoever it is you're blaming for the fact that your job isn't better or you don't get paid more? Why is that group there and undefended that you can take out your rage on them? An individual's anger did not make that happen in society. So while they're not wrong, it's not very good as explanations go. Another explanation that came out of all this research was the idea of the authoritarian personality. Now, authoritarian personalities prefer to have a powerful authority figure telling them what to do. They would like to be able to trust in someone over them who has the answers and can solve the problems. People with authoritarian personalities tend to like black and white answers. They tend to really, really be uncomfortable with ambiguity, particularly about religion or sex. They tend to view people different from themselves as inferior. They always assume their own position is absolutely right. And on the testing they were doing, people who ranked highly for authoritarian personalities also tended to rank highly on measures of racism and on measures of ethnocentrism. Do you remember ethnocentrism from the second week of class? Right? Ethnocentrism is assuming that the way your society does things is natural and healthy, and all societies who do things differently are doing things differently because they're wrong or in league with the devil or crazy or something like that. Right? And these associations continue in the personality tests we do now. But the problem is, after World War II, there was a whole lot of push for people to think to themselves, think outside the box, stand up for what they believe in, not go along with the crowd, not to believe what authority tells you. So when these psychologists stepped up and said authoritarian personality is the cause of racism, what they were saying is bad people causes racism. And of course, that really, no. Good people can also hold all sorts of racist ideas, and good people are frequently part of systems that systematically discriminate. On top of which, societies change very quickly. Some societies have laws that are very restrictive and deny rights to huge chunks of the population, and some societies have very egalitarian societies where people have much more equal access to opportunities and rewards. And sometimes these things change very quickly, right? Societies can be very open and then very repressive and then very open again, all in half of a person's lifetime. And the thing about a personality is it's supposed to be inherent and unchanging. Right? So if it's caused by all of these people having an authoritarian personality, why did they suddenly switch to having libertarian personalities? Right? And that's, no. It is apparently true that authoritarian personalities are more likely to hold racist ideas, but it is not the cause of racism and systematic inequality in societies. And it is really important to remember that there are people in power making decisions that benefit when you point to a group of people and say, oh, it's all their fault. It's not your boss's fault that you're making $7.25 an hour while he's making huge record profits off of your labor. It's the fault of the person who's picking tomatoes for $3.25 an hour. Getting you to blame someone who is not at fault is the underlying situation that sets up problems for both frustration and scapegoating issues and for authoritarian personality issues. And that takes us back to social issues, right? Because sociology looks for answers to questions about why societies do things the way they do in the society, not in the individual brain. All right, so social theory, we talk about functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. We're going to start with functionalism. And that's the perspective that assumes that all parts of societies are connected and that all parts of society work together to keep that society stable and sustainable, and that order and predictability helps maintain that, and that in any situation there are functions and dysfunctions. And functionalists look at societies throughout the world and say, wow, there's an awful lot of in-group, out-group competition. There's an awful lot of hating and blaming people who we don't define as us. Maybe there's something functional about that. And, of course, there is something functional about that. When you've got a group of people who are afraid outsiders are going to hurt them, they'll work really hard. They'll set aside internal differences. They'll take huge risks. They'll put up with stuff without complaining. And you can get the best out of your people if they have someone else to blame for their faults or someone else to be afraid of to, keep them running. But of course, it's also useful for authorities to be able to distract people from failures and problems by being able to manipulate that hate. The obvious example that comes to mind is Nazi Germany, when everything was going so bad for Germany in the 30s because they'd lost World War I, and they were having to pay war reparations, and so many young men had died, and so much infrastructure had been destroyed, and so many people were feeling so bad about themselves. Give them a bunch of groups to hate and blame. It's not your fault. You're the best people in the world. You're the winners. You're the superior. You'll be ruling the whole world if you can just get rid of those people that are tearing you down from inside. Expel them, destroy them, and you will be pure. But, it's not just that. Okay, so everybody in the live class was too young to remember the savings and loan mess in the 80s in the United States. It was really bad in Oklahoma. A lot of banks closed, and because a lot of businesses couldn't get cash to do things, a lot of other businesses struggled. Downtown really went downhill. We were in the middle of expansion and urban redevelopment, and instead it left a pit for over a decade. But toward the end of all this, we had the first Iraq War, which did a wonderful job of distracting people from the fact that it was government policies on how the banks should work that caused the savings and loan mess in the first place. We were busy hating and fearing Saddam Hussein. We didn't think about the mess that we were still a long way from cleaning up at home because our attention was diverted outward. However, in addition to having its uses to being functional, of course, hate and fear of an outgroup, prejudice and discrimination, racism, or religious bigotry can also be very dysfunctional. It can be dysfunctional in that if you've got one group of people that is so marginalized that they are angry and desperate and hopeless that you have to watch them all the time because they're about to riot, that takes up your resources watching them. Or suppose they do riot, and then you've got the riot damage and people you've got to put in jail. Policing and keeping inequality in place is expensive, and it's not a long game. People get tired of it. People resist. It's wasteful that way. In addition, it's wasteful in that, suppose you take 13% of your population and say, I'm sorry, you guys don't get good schools. You guys don't get to go to college. You guys can't have the good jobs. How is this dysfunctional in a capitalist society? In a global capitalist world where countries are competing with each other for production and new ideas and being cutting edge. If you take 13, 14, 30% of your population and say, I'm sorry, we're doing without your physics geniuses. We're doing without your people with math talent. We're doing without your engineers. We're just going to go ahead on the gifts and talents of 87 50% of the population, whatever it is you've got at the top. That is throwing away advantages you really need if you're competing with countries that are using all of their best and brightest. On top of that, it can be dysfunctional to mistreat a minority in your country if other countries refuse to do business with you. I mean, one of the things that really brought down apartheid in South Africa, and yeah, everybody in the live class was too young to remember this either, but one of the big things that broke down apartheid was foreign countries began to say, no more. We don't want to be part of this anymore. We won't lend you money. We won't buy your stuff. We won't engage in any kind of economic activity with any business based in your country or with your government until you stop this nonsense and get actual democracy, actual freedom, actual equal protection under the law. And yeah, things in South Africa, there's still a whole lot of inequality. There's still a whole lot of poverty, and most of it is still black. There is still a whole lot of bad that needs to be fixed. But things are much better than they were. Okay, so that's functionalism. The conflict perspective is about groups. Conflict theory says society is formed of people who join groups with other people they perceive to be like them in order to get their group a bigger piece of the pie. And so you've got people who make judgments about what race other people are in and what other races other people... Sorry, tongue-tied. So yeah, people join, assign themselves, believe themselves to be, and perform membership in groups of people who they think share their ethnicity, but that's never all that's going on for conflict theorists, right? Because for them it's also always about money. And it is in the interests of people who are rich and powerful, of people who own factories and businesses, to make sure that there are disposable workforces, that they can hire when the economy is good and lay off when the economy is bad. It's in their best interest that employees never join together and make demands for working conditions. If every potential worker in the United States, every single one, demanded 3 weeks vacation, $15 an hour, and on-site daycare, what would employers have to provide? I mean, it's true, capital can cross borders. They could take their business, their factory to some other country, and many of them have, but there are some things you just can't do somewhere else. And if everybody who might have a job demands the same working conditions, companies would have no choice but to offer that. But if you can keep your people from joining together because, oh, those are the people who cause all the crime, and those are the people who are stealing our jobs, and those people will do what we're doing, but they'll take less, and those people don't hold our values, so we can't get close to them. If you can keep your workers divided by those hate and blame and fear, then they won't come together and cooperate against you. So conflict theory says it's all about exploitation. That the tendency for people to join in-groups and out-groups is manipulated by people who benefit from people not trusting other people. Okay, so we will pick up next time with symbolic interactionism, because labeling theory is kind of complicated. And have a great day.